Now let's create the base for our tower. So here at the connectivity, so here we have the connectivity attribute. So to isolate the very first part of our ring, so let's add a blast node. So here onto the blast node, we can say add class, if add class is equal to 0, and let's check delete non-selected to isolate our very first ring. Okay, so because no matter how many we add the length segments, the very first ring will always be the 0. Okay, so we can use the add class is equal to 0. Okay, and now let's add a poly extrude, and let's extrude this base onto the inside. So let's add a negative distance. So this distance is not working correctly, so let's zero it out, and let's go into the spine control, and down here let's change the thickness to lower to create an accurately going inside faces. Okay, so here onto the extrusion, let's enable our side group, and let's add a blast and isolate our these newly created faces. So here onto the blast, select the extrude side group and choose the delete non-selected to isolate these new faces. And here let's select the very bottom part of our base. So let's add another connectivity node to look for the connectivity of these two primitives, these two geometries. Let's change this to primitive, and here let's add another blast node, and in this blast we can say if at class is equal to 1. So now because we only have two connected pieces of geometry, so the first one will have the class attribute of 0 and the bottom one have the 1. Okay, so here we are isolating the class 1. Okay, now let's add a group range, group by range, and select every one of 2, and let's call this group to be a base group. So the group name set to base, and let's add a blast node to isolate our base primitive, and let's select our base group and click the delete non-selected to isolate our base. Okay, so after that let's add a poly extrude node. Let's add the distance to -1, and let's go into the spine control and onto the thickness. Let's lower the thickness. Let's reverse this by adding a reverse node, and after here, so here when we created the base group, let's add another poly extrude node to create a thickness. So let's give him some distance, and let's check output back to create the back faces. And now let's merge both of our geometries. Okay, so here we have the base, and now let's create the base pillars. So let's create a line. Here we have a line. Let's add a transform node, and let's move the line in the X. Okay, now let's add a rotation at the Z, and let's add a mirror node to mirror our these pillars both side. Let's rotate them until they meet, and let's add a sweep node to add a thickness to the sweep. Let's change this to square tube. I'll also add the single polygon end cap. Okay, so let's go back on the transform. Let's add a little bit of more spacing and also adjust the width to a lower value. Go back to the transform node and let's bring them back again. Okay, so now I want to copy these base pillar at the end of these bases. Okay, so here at the reverse node, when we extruded this our base faces, so let's add another blast to isolate our base faces again. So let's select the base group and choose the delete non-selected to isolate our base group, and let's add the point at the center of our base primitive. So here, as you can see, we have some problems where we have the two primitives selected, and that is because here onto the sweep and onto the columns we have the odd number of columns. So if we change this to 48, now the problem is solved. So here onto this group range, and at the range filter let's add the calculation of the even and odd. Okay, so let's copy the parameter from the sweep. So these are the column. Let's copy this parameter and let's go into the group by range node, and let's select this and say paste relative reference, and here we can say mod 2. Okay, and let's add the 2 at the very first. So 2 plus this calculation. Okay, so now if we go back onto the sweep again, and if we change it back to odd, you see now our problem is gone. So let's go back at the base, and now let's add the point at the center of each primitive. So let's add a node called extract centroid. Let's connect that. So here extract centroid is expecting a name attribute, so currently we don't have the name attribute. So let's change this where it says run over pieces. So let's change this to primitive. So now we are running on at every single primitive. Okay, so if I enable my points, so here as you can see we have the points at the center of our primitive. Okay, so now let's connect these points by adding an add SOP. So here onto the add, let's change this to polygon and by group, and let's connect all points and check the close to create a closed circle. Okay, so now let's add a copy to curve to copy these base pillars onto this circle. So let's connect our geometry, and these are our curve, and let's set the display flag on copy to curves. So the orientation is not correct, so let's go into the copy to curve node and onto the additional rotation. Let's apply yaw, and let's apply yaw at the 90 degrees. Okay, let's add a null at the end, and let's call this one to be base pillars, and let's merge it with our rest of our model, and let's set the display flag. So now here as you can see the position of our pillar is not correct. So if I set the display flag onto the copy to curve, and template my circle. So here, as you can see, so the geometry has been copied at the top of this point, but I want at the bottom. So let's add a match size node, and let's resize our this geometry by this circle bounds, and let's set the display flag onto the match size, and let's here onto the justify x, let's change this to none and none. So we don't want the justification on x or z, but only onto the y. So here let's change this to minimum or maximum. Okay, so now we are placing our base geometry at the very bottom. Okay, so now let's connect this into our base pillar null, and now let's view it here at the merge. Okay, so now the offset is still not correct, and that is because we are not including this our base geometry into the scene. So let's connect this into the main merge as well, and now if we see, so here as you can see our base are working correctly. Okay, so if I go back onto the line, and if I change my length, and I can change my columns, and here onto the sweep I can adjust the overall radius, I can adjust its scale, and our whole system will work fine. Okay, so here onto the base, let's duplicate this whole base network to create a more detailed structure. Okay, so here we have the base pillars, and this is our top base. Let's first merge both of them, adding a merge. Okay, press and hold the Y key on your keyboard and drag to cut the wires, and let's connect this into our null, and here let's add a copy and transform node. Let's connect it here, and here we are creating the two copies, and let's scale these copies down in the X and Z direction. So let's copy this parameter and paste it here as well, paste relative reference. Okay, so whenever I change this will be changed automatically. Okay, so here I can adjust the number of copies. I can also add the rotation. Okay, so now we are creating a more structure. Okay, now if we see it with our geometry, and now let's add a match size at the end as well to make it sit onto the floor. Let's connect it here, and let's change the justification Y to minimum. So now it is perfectly sitting onto the floor. Okay, and at the very last, let's create a null and call this one to be nuclear cooling tower. Okay, so in the next lesson, let's convert this cooling tower into a digital asset. Okay.